The distance between two notes is called an interval. We need to be able to describe intervals in order to discuss scales, chords, and melodies. We will talk about steps and skips first. If the distance between two notes only moves by one letter of the musical alphabet, it is called a step. And if it moves by more than one letter, it's called a skip. Now let's go ahead and look at the musical keyboard to get a visual representation of steps and skips. Let's go ahead and add our musical alphabet to the keys. We've got A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and at that point, it repeats. Now remember, if the distance between two notes moves by one letter of the musical alphabet, it's called a step. Let's start with the note E, for example, and we will move up to the letter F. Now would you say that's a step or a skip? Since it only moves by one letter name, it's going to be a step. Now let's stay on the same note E, and let's go down to the note C. Would you say that's a step or a skip? If you said skip, you are correct, because it moves by more than one letter name. We've got 1, 2, giving us that skip. Let's get a little more detailed now and discuss half steps and whole steps. A half step is the smallest interval in common music, and there are 12 half steps that evenly divide the musical alphabet before it repeats. A whole step is simply an interval of two half steps. Now the easy way to think of half steps and whole steps is to ask yourself a question. Are the notes touching, or is there a note in between the two notes that you're comparing? For example, let's start on the note G. Now if we move up to the first white key, which would be the note A, would that be a half step or whole step? If you said whole step, you're correct, and that's because there is one note separating these two notes, and that would be G sharp, or you could also call it A flat, depending on what direction you're moving. Now let's do one more for example. Let's start on the note F, and we will move down to the note E. Now we are using two separate letter names, but you still have to ask yourself, is there a note separating these two keys? And the answer is no, so that makes this a half step. Now you also want to become familiar with the two sets of white keys that are touching, which do not have a black key separating them. And that would be between B and C, as well as E and F. These two sets of keys can easily be mistaken for a whole step because we definitely changed notes in the musical alphabet. But you have to remember there is no black key in between those two white keys. Now let's go ahead and do some examples to test your knowledge on half steps and whole steps. Let's start with the letter E. And we'll go down to the letter D. Is that a half step or a whole step? If you said whole step, you are correct. Let's do another. We will start with the note B and go up to the note D flat. Is that a half step or a whole step? One way to figure this out is to count the half steps in between each note. We're going from B to C, which is one half step, and then C up to the next black key, which is one more half step. So two half steps equal a whole step. Let's do one last example. Let's start on the note A flat, and we will go down to the note G. Is that a half step or a whole step? There are no other notes separating these two keys, therefore it is a half step. Go ahead to the next lecture, which begins our discussion of one of the most important aspects of music, scales.